Hello all, and a very warm welcome to week 6 of Story and Audience, and more specifically to part 2 of our introduction to transmedia storytelling. For those students enrolled in the unit who I haven't had a chance to meet just yet, my name is Dr. Guy Harris, and this is actually my first semester here at IMIT, coming across from Monash Uni, where I've been working for the past 2 years, teaching across various units in media and communication, after finishing my PhD a few years ago in 2022. At week 6 for Story and Audience, we're now officially at the halfway mark of classes for semester 1, believe it or not. And it's been really wonderful working with the 2 workshops running on Mondays, and my great pleasure also to be contributing to this lecture series in Story and Audience. So, as the title sequence to this video suggests and hopefully illustrates, the focus of today's lecture is on aspects of transmediality, relating specifically to notions of place, people, and plot. As an introduction and a continuation of sorts to some of the fundamentals of transmedia storytelling introduced last week by Dan, the focus of this week is on aspects of character, action, and location as core elements of storytelling, which we'll seek to frame specifically within a broader understanding of transmediality. As an extension of last week's lecture, hopefully these intros to transmedia storytelling function as a little bit of a toolkit for your creative practice and inform your own approach to storytelling, which may already be somewhat conceptualized within a transmedia framework, considering the nature of media cultures today. Importantly, also, both week 5 and week 6 lectures hopefully provide a little bit of a foundational understanding of some different approaches to transmedial storytelling, which can be applied directly to your transmedia storytelling projects, set for assignment number 2 in this unit and potentially for assignment number 3, which is due at the end of week 13. Before diving into some details relating to place, people, and plot, I wanted to perhaps begin by picking up on some foundational ideas with regard to transmedia storytelling that were introduced by Dan in last week's lecture. Let's go to the slides. Week 6 in Story and Audience, Transmedia Storytelling Fundamentals, Part 2. Okay, just before we begin, here's a little bit of an outline of the ideas we're going to be covering as part of this week's lecture. Beyond a brief introduction that hopefully adds to our foundational understanding of transmedia storytelling, we're going to be looking essentially at some classic features of narrative storytelling such as people, place, and plot, which will be framed in relationship to some of the concerns and indeed the creative approaches of transmediality. A consideration of people relates to the construction and centrality of character in narrative storytelling and transmedia practices. Places essentially correlates to narrative aspects relating to time and setting, and a discussion of plot concerns some broader ideas relating to story events and action, and how a transmedia storytelling approach might inform some of the ways that these elements of classic narrativity might be understood from the creative perspective. That sits in alignment in many ways with Jenkins' understanding of transmediality, where integral elements of a story are disseminated systematically across multiple channels in order to generate a uniform and synchronized entertainment experience. And to finish things off, I thought we might firstly balance out our discussion of fiction-based transmediality with a little bit of an engagement with non-fiction approaches to transmedia storytelling, just to engage with non-fiction a little bit more. The focus does tend to be very much on fiction-based to transmediality. And then lastly, to conclude, I thought we might scaffold a discussion to explore a little further in workshops this week. Essentially the idea of looking closely at some of the media that we consume and any examples of transmedia storytelling that might have popped up in your feeds lately. I know I certainly have had some interesting things pop up in my feeds this week, especially with regard to a band and a cultural project coming out of Belfast in Northern Ireland called Kneecap. Their transmedial approach to film and to music and to politics is really quite fascinating, and it presents itself as a really interesting point of discussion that we can take up a little bit later on towards the end of this lecture. Okay, a quick recap. What is transmedia storytelling? So as a way of briefly reviewing some of the foundational ideas of transmedia storytelling introduced by Dan in last week's lecture, as well as extending a slightly broader understanding of transmediality, I thought it might be worthwhile to begin this week's lecture by highlighting some interesting ideas from this week's readings with regard to transmedia storytelling and its broader historical relationship with the idea of transnarrativity as outlined by Swiss media theorist Marie-Laure Ryan in one of this week's lectures. Revisiting the foundational definition of transmedia storytelling outlined by Dan in last week's lecture, which was proposed by Henry Jenkins in 2006, we know that transmedia storytelling represents a process where integral elements of a fiction get systematically dispersed across multiple delivery channels for the purpose of creating a unified and coordinated entertaining experience. Ideally, each medium makes up its own unique contribution to the unfolding of a story. Within Jenkins' conceptual framework of transmediality, each story is essentially an autonomous and standalone communicative structure for the audience to engage with, having no prior knowledge of the broader story world and affiliated drama. But importantly, Jenkins asserts that each narrative is working towards a unified entertainment experience. And that notion of unified entertainment experience is something that's quite central to Jenkins' relationship with transmedia storytelling in general. As mentioned in previous weeks, as part of the story and audience unit, Henry Jenkins presents himself as definitely somewhat of an important figure within media studies, and we know and we've heard about his important contributions to the theoretical and conceptual understandings of media studies with regard to fan studies and with regard to participatory culture as well, which we've covered in previous lectures and also in previous workshops as well. Interestingly, while I was doing some prep for this week's lecture, I learnt that Jenkins wasn't the first person to actually use the term transmedia storytelling. Its proper historical attribution is duly given to Dr. Marcia Kinder from the University of Southern California, and she first used it in 1991 when she was describing works where characters appear across multiple media, describing herself describing these examples essentially as transmedia intertextuality. But it was, of course, Professor Henry Jenkins who nonetheless brought transmedia to popular attention in 2006 with the publication of his book Convergence Culture, where he reframed Kinder's term to describe heavily integrated cross-platform narratives, such as The Matrix, a really central example for him actually, as essentially examples of a new media phenomena, one that was a cultural and a technological expression of the contemporary society, an expression of the society that he was observing as a person who's long attended to media culture, and a society that was in 2006 very much in a state of flux, transitioning towards a digitally networked society that we know today. So in 2006, Jenkins writes, "Welcome to Convergence Culture, where old and new media collide, where grassroots and corporate media intersect, where the power of the media producer and the power of the media consumer interact in unpredictable ways. Convergence culture is the future." So in Jenkins' Convergence Culture, He concerns himself with essentially 4 aspects of convergence that include economic, technological, social, and cultural. Jenkins' core claim, in a sense, is the central contention. This is the central contention, essentially, sort of in convergence culture, is that convergence culture essentially represents a historically significant shift in the public's relationship to media. As we heard in last week's lecture with Dan, it's within the context of Jenkins' analysis of media culture that he develops and presents his concept of transmedia storytelling as a form of communication that's very much a product and a distinct expression of digitally integrated culture. For Jenkins, transmedia communication and narrative storytelling sits at the heart of his ideas about convergence culture. And in 2006, with the publication of his book, Convergence Culture, Where Old and New Media Collide, Jenkins' conceptualization of transmedia storytelling functions essentially as a critical extension of his long investment and his long-standing research into storytelling practices and new media technologies. Okay, so responding to the idea of transmedia storytelling as a contemporary communicative phenomena and a product of the new media environment, media theorist, who I spoke about just before, makes a quite important and very interesting point in the journal article, Transmedia Storytelling, Industry Buzzword or New Narrative Expression, which is listed as one of this week's readings. If you have a chance to have a look at that at some point, that'd be amazing. As she states that while transmedia storytelling can be regarded as a distinct and significant new form of storytelling for the digital age, and one that possesses a unique potential for the evolution of narrativity and storytelling processes, it's also very important to recognise that it's arguably also a phenomenon that can be understood as a modern expression of a certain tendency that has existed in culture before and existed indeed in visual cultures for thousands of years. And I actually really love this, essentially framing this understanding of transmedia storytelling within a broader historical context of transnarrativity. And Marie-Laure Ryan essentially kind of brings into play almost a conceptual framework of media archaeology as well, which is an area of particular interest for me, which seeks to understand modern media culture by closely examining media systems and practices of the past. Now, to make this point, Ryan refers to a number of examples in transnarrativity and processes of illustration. So she refers to a number of examples of transnarrativity, including illustration, adaptation, derivation, and pastiche. And while she qualifies that these aren't expressions of transmedia storytelling by our current definition of the concept and phenomena, there's nonetheless, they nonetheless present themselves as cultural examples of the ways that stories have tended to migrate essentially across media forms as narratives have gained awareness and popularity in culture and society, just as transmedia narratives do in our contemporary media systems. Some examples used by Ryan include the relationship between the Bible as a narrative text and the history of fine art, where thousands of stories have essentially found depiction in illustration in paintings and in illustrations, in artworks and even in architectural features. Similarly, Ryan makes reference to stories such as the ancient Greek myths and the trans-narrative migration of stories from text to objects such as plates and vases in ancient Greek culture as essentially visual mediums for storytelling itself. Here's an excellent example of this form of transmedia that Ryan is referring to, just on the left of this slide here. Quite a beautiful vase. Here we see the very famous Stamnos vase, which is currently kept in the British Museum collection, which is called the Siren vase or vase. It was made in 480 BC, and it depicts the famous siren scene from Homer's epic poem, the Odyssey. It's in this Stamnos vase that we can see Ulysses tied to the mast of the ship under the spell of these sirens, these mystical half-bird, half-woman creatures who circle above the ship overhead, while these men are seen rowing on with beeswax stuck in his ears to protect them from hearing the siren song. In Transmedia Storytelling, Industry Buzzword or New Narrative Experience, Ryan writes, if transmedia storytelling is going to be a truly new narrative experience, it'll be useful to take a look at other more older phenomena that bear a certain resemblance with it, but from which it should differ. Importantly also, as you'll read in the article when you get to it, Ryan uses these historical examples not just to broaden our historical understanding of transmediality as a form of transnarrativity, but also to focus and essentially refine our understanding of what transmedia storytelling is and what makes it a distinct form of storytelling in our present media culture of today. Okay, so moving on, let's begin our consideration of some fundamental elements of narrative storytelling within the framework of transmediality, beginning with that hugely important aspect of storytelling that is, of course, character. Okay, before concentrating on the specific relationship between character and transmedia storytelling, so it might be helpful just to do a quick overview of the place of character in storytelling traditions and its place within narrative systems as a bit of a foundation for a more informed consideration of transmedia storytelling and various creative approaches that might be employed as ways in which to explore characters across different platforms, different mediums, and different delivery channels. Certainly within the context of narrative theory, a broad history of storytelling and no doubt your own relationships with narratives and stories, I think it's fair to say that characters occupy a position of importance and a position of centrality to storytelling practices and narrativity in general. As you'll no doubt understand from your own relationship with storytelling, characters are incredibly important to narrative function. They commonly drive the plot of a story, they reveal underlying themes of storylines, and commonly construct empathic links with audience members, facilitating connection with stories both on a personal and on an emotional level as well. Okay, so here's a little bit of a list with a few of the ways that characters broadly contribute to storytelling as important tools and devices for narrative structure. Driving the plot. As mentioned, a character's actions, their decisions, and their reactions to events essentially propel stories forward. They create conflicts as well as resolution. Characters' actions and decisions they make are in many ways the story engines that drive plot, and well-developed characters are often centrally linked to drama, and in turn the audience's own investment in the story. Revealing themes. Through their experiences, their conflicts, and their transformations, characters can illuminate the story's underlying themes and messages, and on occasion offer some insight into human nature, the human condition, or potentially their story world, which can duly map onto our own perceptions and our own understandings of people and the world as an audience. Creating emotional connections is important as well. As audiences, we invest in stories when we connect with characters that we like. We can't help but empathise with their struggles and celebrate their triumphs, which ultimately leads to a more engaging and impactful and meaningful narrative experience in many ways. Characters centrally linked to narrative effectiveness as well. Well-developed characters with their own motivations, flaws, and growths make stories essentially kind of more believable, more relatable, and ultimately more effective. Compelling characters, whether they're heroes or villains or supporting figures, they leave a lasting impression on readers and audience members, making stories essentially more memorable and impactful. And lastly, characters and the audience itself. It's really quite common for the audience to remember or form an emotional connection with stories based on the characters encountered. And memorable characters can be the difference between a story's popularity and a story's longevity and acclaim, or alternatively its lack of success, essentially as a story, but also in a broader sense a vessel for the transmission of culture. Okay, character design. This is a really important one. Key features of character design. Now, before we look at some techniques and creative approaches to exploring and developing characters in transmedia stories, it might be valuable, firstly, just to have a quick look at some features, some key features of character design and conceptualization, which might help inform some of the ways that transmedial approaches to storytelling can be beneficial to character development, character expansion, and characterization in general. The process of creating believable, engaging, and multidimensional characters with distinct personalities and motivations is an aspect of classic narrative storytelling that's connected to character design and character conceptualization, and one which helps drive plots forward, enrich storylines, and generally enhance narrativity and its impact for the audience. Character conceptualization and design involves more than just simply giving a character a name, a job, or a simple identity. In many ways, it's about envisaging their inner world, their flaws and their strengths, how they react to situations, and in turn, how they relate to others as well. It can help embody a character's personality, underscore underlying character motivations, provide some kind of insight into their fundamental role within a story. Crucially also provides a starting point for character development, character evolution, forms of character transformation, which are hugely important within narrative structures as well, but we'll talk about them again shortly. Well-developed characters can also effectively enhance story processes and can make narratives more engaging and relatable to the audience. There's many different aspects of character design and conceptualization that contribute towards the construction of multi-dimensional and engaging characters that can provide both depth and complexity. But here's essentially three aspects of character design that could be useful to consider as transmedial techniques, potentially in the transmedia story projects you're going to be doing as for assignment number 2, and potentially later as well for assignment number 3 due at the end of the semester. And these, and as transmedial techniques, they can help facilitate creative approaches to character that helps them transcend the bounds of a single medium story. Okay, social backgrounds. A character's social status, their occupation, their community ties, as well as religious or political affiliations can contribute significantly to the overall character conceptualization. A character born into wealth or into affluence or royalty or aristocracy, for example, may have very different mannerisms and attire and demeanor than, say, someone born into a working class background. Relationships also, the way that a character tends to interrelate, treat others, as well as relate to other protagonists in a story, can tend actions and narrative developments, as well as be profoundly informative from an audience's perspective. And thirdly, psychological or emotional makeup. This is an important one too. A character's psyche or emotional state can help embody important aspects of a character, such as their personality, their personal drive, emotional motivation, and I suppose their centrality to a story's core drama. Aspect of a character's inner life, such as their fears, aspirations, and secrets, can be hugely impactful upon plot, emotional drama, and audience connectivity as well. Similarly, aspects of a character's emotional makeup and behaviour, such as strengths and weaknesses, as well as tendencies towards being brave or kind or cynical or cautious, can impact directly upon narrative drama and plot as well. And character transformation, this is an important one. Finally, just before we consider some strategies and techniques of transmedial storytelling for the development of character, a final foundational aspect of character design is to quickly consider is the importance of transformation and character evolution within stories and classic narrative systems. And this relates directly to the idea of character arcs. So character arcs are essentially the transformation of characters within narrative systems, and historically they've been really very central to classic narrative storytelling and a crucial device for establishing relatable narratives, crafting authentic story experiences for the audience, and facilitating investment in storylines with the drama of a character often mirroring the emotional lives and struggles and transformative changes that occur around our own lives in real life. In terms of character arcs, a character arc is the transformation or inner journey of a character over the course of a story. If a story has a character arc, the character essentially begins at one point as essentially one sort of person and gradually transforms into another or different sort of person in response to changing developments within the story. Broadly speaking, there are essentially three types of definitive character arcs in classic narrative story writing, though a more complex approach to to character transformation may well incorporate multiple elements concurrently. But broadly speaking, here's the three. Transformative arcs is the first one. Generally an arc of a character transformation that involves progression or growth. For example, a character transforms from being in a state of naivety or in a fearful state to being brave or knowledgeable about themselves or the world that they inhabit. And some classic stories such as Harry Potter or Paul Atreides or Luke Skywalker essentially kind of fall into this character of transformative character arcs. The other one is an interesting one. It's the steadfast arc. It's essentially a character who remains largely the same but grows in their resolve or their understanding. And the other slightly kind of like tragic arc is the decline arc, a character who starts strong and ends up ending up in a weakened morally compromised state. And I suppose the trajectory of Anakin Skywalker and his transformation into Darth Vader is almost the classic embodiment of this arc of decline in some ways. The journey of it that a character takes through a story, their growth or their change, has historically been regarded as a crucial aspect of storytelling and central to creating meaning and constructing engaging storylines. And it's been quite pivotal in storytelling because it fundamentally provides depth and relatability, and tends to enhance a viewer or a reader's connection to character. So hugely important, and actually hugely dramatic within narrative structures as well. The other aspect of transformation that's hugely important within narrative structures as well is conflict and transformation. Now, in terms of how character arcs work, a significant internal change or evolution that a character might undergo throughout a narrative might be in association to certain events or revelations. However, the primary device that drives characters' transformation in narrative structures is, of course, conflict as a tool, as a mechanism. Conflict in many ways sits at the heart of classic storytelling and is closely connected to both a story's plot and its central threads of tension and drama. It's one of the central elements driving a narrative forward in classic narrative storytelling. And it's of course extremely important to character transformation as well. Whether it's internal emotional or psychological struggles, external challenges or interpersonal disagreements, conflicts commonly engage the audience and they foster and facilitate character development and, importantly, contribute to the drama of a story. Okay, so in terms of their function, the function of conflict within narrative story, it tends to drive the plot, create amazing tension and drama, reveal aspects of character, as well as explore themes. So in terms of its general relationship to story, conflict, whether internal or external, forces characters to take action and overcome obstacles. And it propels the story forward, and it's one of the main mechanisms that writers use to essentially kind of drive the plot of a story. When constructed well, it has the emotional effect of creating tension, introducing uncertainty and creating suspense and making the audience wonder what will happen next, essentially constructing investment in a story's outcome. Additionally, also has the capacity to reveal aspects of character themselves, which is an important storytelling device, with characters' reactions to conflict revealing their strengths and their weaknesses, their flaws, their internal motivations and values, essentially providing the audience with a deeper understanding of who characters are on a fundamental level. And lastly, it can be used very effectively to explore narrative themes, explore deeper meanings about people and society, explore universal truths, for example, or apparent falsehoods, or potentially highlight some of the complexities of human relationships or the challenges that we face in our own life. Now, in terms of character as the focus of our concern, the relationship between conflict and character transformation can perhaps be summarized as the difference between internal and external conflict. External conflict, as you can imagine, essentially embodies struggles with external forces, with other characters, with rivals, with nature, with society or politics, or potentially even with the supernatural. But conversely, internal conflict, as you can imagine, is that which happens within the confines of the internal world. Whilst conflict with an external or outside force relates, as mentioned before, to struggles with things such as characters and rivals within story structures, or antagonists, or natural disasters, or society, or the supernatural, internal conflict, by contrast, relates to a character's struggle with their emotions, with their psychological obstacles, with their own thoughts, for example, their emotionality, their beliefs, their personal history, and potentially even the memories that are attached to their personal history. It's with regard to aspects of internal struggle that the relationship with character design is actually hugely important. And character conceptualization that we discussed before is of central importance within this process of character transformation. In terms of character conceptualization, that we mentioned before, the process of establishing a character's initial personality, such as their beliefs, their internal struggles, their flaws, their fears, essentially establishes the groundwork and a point of departure in many ways for the narrative processes of character transformation that are so important within story structures. Now, in terms of how it works, it typically follows a character arc. The character arc involves essentially a starting point or some kind of initialization that then leads to a number of different challenges or conflicts, and finally to some form of resolution or final state where the character is changed or been fundamentally transformed in some kind of way. The introduction of challenges and obstacles essentially forces characters to grow and evolve in some way, and it's the demonstration of a character's growth through their actions and their reactions to conflict, be that internal or external, that ultimately leads to not only the relatability of characters, but the audience's emotional investment in their journey as protagonists as well. In my opinion, the various dramatic aspects of internal conflicts set up in parallel with external conflicts in character story worlds presents itself as a really interesting and hugely effective technique for heightening drama and promoting character investment. And it's this aspect of transformation in story structures that offers quite a lot of potential to develop and explore transmedial approaches to storytelling. We're going to chat about that in detail in the following section. Now, just before we move on, it might be important to explore the importance of character transformation and kind of underscore why it's such an important tool within character design to a large extent. So in terms of character design and the trajectory of characters within narrative structures, character transformation has been historically regarded as a critical element of narrative story writing, and a technique that adds depth and realism to characters, essentially making them more engaging and relatable to the audience. As we've discussed, transformation can be driven by internal or external forces. It can be emotional or moral or physical, and it fundamentally alters how characters interact with their story world and with characters in a story. In addition to adding depth and adding complexity and relatability to characters for the audience who can see themselves in characters' journey, grappling with challenges and overcoming obstacles, the narrative tool of transformation allows character arcs to essentially explore universal themes as well, like resilience and growth and the human capacity for change, making stories more meaningful and engaging ultimately. And in a sense, it could be argued that a well-constructed and executed character transformation can provide a sense of closure and a satisfaction for the audience as well, as they potentially grow a little themselves on the journey with a character who might have learnt a valuable lesson or struggled against challenges with internal or external forces to potentially reach their potential. Okay. So after that quite detailed analysis of character development within the context of classic narrative structures, we now consider essentially some of those learnings and how those learnings might well be applied and might well inform our understanding of transmedia storytelling approaches. So as explored previously, we know from Jenkins' important contribution to our understanding of transmedia storytelling that transmedia storytelling represents a process where integral elements of a fiction essentially get dispersed systematically across multiple delivery channels for the purpose of creating a unified and coordinated entertainment experience. Jenkins also adds that ideally each medium makes its own unique contribution to the unfolding story. So with regard to creative approaches towards the exploration or expansion of character across multiple channels or delivery systems, such articulations could well include, but not necessarily be limited to, things such as films, indeed prequels or sequels, or even story strands. It could include television series, animation series, games, and even short-form approaches such as online short-form video, for example, or cartoons, or even memes. As a fundamental aspect of transmedia storytelling approaches, the dissemination of media across multiple delivery channels involves, to a greater or lesser degree, a process referred to in media studies as fragmentation. In transmedia storytelling, the term fragmentation refers to the way that a narrative is essentially broken down into smaller, often disconnected pieces or perspectives across different media channels, rather than a single linear narrative story in a sense. Instead of a traditional linear story, for example, that unfolds chronologically, transmedia storytelling often presents the narrative in fragments or vignettes, each exploring a specific aspect of the story or character. This deliberate dispersal of narrative elements across multiple platforms and media constitutes a key feature of transmedia storytelling, with each new text making a distinctive and valuable contribution to the whole, just to quote Jenkins again. And it requires audiences to actively piece together elements of the story world from these fragmented pieces, in a sense. Now, as a result of this almost prismatic approach to storytelling, this process of fragmentation allows for multiple viewpoints and timelines to be explored independently, potentially creating a more complex and engaging experience for the audience, with each platform or medium contributing to the overall story world, offering unique perspectives, characters, and storylines that ideally complement each other in the narrative, mean that audiences and viewers may jump between different times, places, or characters, disrupting a traditional linear flow or storytelling approach, and in effect potentially creating a more complex and layered story that rewards attentive viewers. A feature of this approach is also that fragmentation can encourage audience engagement and participation as they piece together the story from various sources, and may well manage to connect with a broader audience as a result of this process of fragmentation as well, that essentially results in multi-platform and multi-channel approach to storytelling. As to whether this approach to multi-channel storytelling ultimately adheres to Jenkins' assertion about the ideal aim of creating a single cohesive story is a point of contention, which is taken up by Roberta Pearson in this week's reading Transmedia Characters, Additionality and Cohesion in the Transfiction Hero, which we're going to actually discuss in a little bit of detail shortly. Within the context of transmedia storytelling, there's numerous ways and creative approaches towards the exploration and development of characters. But for the purpose of this lecture, it might be good to focus on two very popular and effective approaches to character expansion that's used in transmedia storytelling approaches, which include backstory and story strands, two incredibly useful and important aspects of character development in a sense. So let's begin first with backstory. Backstory and character expansion are kind of inherently linked in a sense. Backstory, as many you'll be aware of, is a very popular literary device which has been long used in storytelling traditions, and one which is extremely effective within the context of transmedia storytelling. The reason why it's so popular and effective is that it allows not only for the provision of expanded story worlds, but for the expansion and development of character, closely linking to character conceptualization and character profiles that we discussed just before, facilitating rich details about characters' past to be narrativized, and explored in close association with aspects of character design, ranging from a character's behaviour or psychological state to their outward appearance. What comes to mind immediately in this sense is actually the story of Batman as a purveyor of justice, whose motivation for his behaviour might be partly explained by the injustices of his own childhood and his backstory that involves the murder of his parents when he was only 8 years old, which has been explored in comics and in animations and selected scenes from films as well. The importance of backstory as a form of exposition is one that essentially provides additional layers of complexity for the purposes of character development. Additionally, it can provide a sense of depth and dimensionality in narrative structures, essentially offering some really valuable insights into a character's motivations, into their personalities, and into their actions and their behaviours. In terms of backstory as a storytelling device and a tool for character development, it can be particularly useful for the provision of historical, emotional, or psychological context for characters as well, and for really fascinating insights into character motivations within the events of a story or the plots of a text. In terms of providing additional layers of complexity to a text, a well-crafted backstory can also facilitate investment in characters, and historically it's been used really effectively to foster a sense of empathy and engagement in the story. Specifically with regard to transmedia storytelling, character backstory can be explored extremely effectively actually across multiple media platforms to explore aspects of a story as well as to develop and explore character, achieving many of the same things as backstory in traditional storytelling approaches, but essentially incorporating multiple channels and modes of narrative delivery. Backstory can be used to delve deeper into a character's motivations, into their relationships and past experiences, providing richer character development and allowing audiences essentially to connect more deeply with characters. The connection to world building and expanded story worlds is important too. In addition to providing valuable character insights, well-crafted backstories can also be used to build more complex and believable story worlds for narrative structures, exploring dimensions of character within a context of explanations that might relate to story world history or culture or to customs. And in terms of audience expansion, the dissemination of narratives relating to a specific character essentially create additional points of connection with an audience. And whilst this has the potential of expanding the audience of a story or of a text, it also fosters and arguably facilitates fandom and the preservation of existing audiences for projects of ongoing narrative continuation and expansion. Closely related and aligned with backstory in many ways, story strands also present themselves as a very popular and effective way in which to explore and develop character utilizing transmedial storytelling approaches. In terms of a definition, a story or narrative strand refers essentially to an individual interconnected narrative or story element that is presented across different media platforms to contribute to a larger unified story experience. What comes immediately to mind actually when I think about story strands is the Mandalorian series, as an extension of the Star Wars universe, which essentially explores and develops the character of Mando Jinjarin, who didn't actually appear in any of the Star Wars films. The inclusion of Baby Yoda connects the series to the original Star Wars trilogy and subsequent films, but it's very much a separate and standalone series as well that's constructed primarily for the purpose of developing and exploring the characters of Mando and indeed the world and the culture of the Mandalorians within the Star Wars experience. Whilst the Mandalorian could perhaps be classified as a backstory for Baby Yoda, the centrality of Mando as the main protagonist essentially makes me lean more towards it being classified as a story strand as opposed to a backstory per se. In terms of story strands within transmedia storytelling, in many ways they function very similarly to backstory, with the only qualifier being that they commonly explore the background of minor or adjacent characters and correlative narrative moments within a story world. But like backstory, they can be a very successful way to develop and explore ancillary characters and indeed expand story worlds, as The Mandalorian arguably did so very successfully, adding an extra narrative layer and detail to the story world of that much beloved galaxy far, far away. In a sense, in a similar sense to backstory, story strands in transmedia stories construct interwoven narratives across multiple communicative channels. They facilitate diverse perspectives, and they can add a really rich sense of detail to characters within established story worlds as well. Okay, so to place some of these elements of storytelling relating to character expansion and creative transmediality into a little bit of a critical context, I wanted to briefly discuss some ideas from this week's reading, drawing our attention again to Roberta Pearson's article, Transmedia Characters, Additionality and Cohesion in Transfictional Heroes. As the name of the work would suggest, the focus of Pearson's chapter is essentially on additionality as it relates to the creation and addition of new transmedia works to existing stories and story worlds. And the principle of cohesion, which in some ways cannot help but echo Jenkins' original hope for all narratives in transmedia project work towards a unified entertainment experience. With regard to the concept of cohesion, Pearson's position, whilst not strictly advocating a strict adherence, is nonetheless one which endorses its centrality to transmedia storytelling, whereby cohesion refers to the consistency and the interconnectedness of a narrative across various media platforms, ensuring that the story elements and characters remain recognisable and unified, essentially creating a cohesive experience for the audience. Analysing a number of culturally significant texts and iconic characters within contemporary practices of transmedia storytelling, Pearson helpfully identifies points of contact on page 149, essentially points of connection or exchange as intertextual links, as something of a metric by which might help determine or at least help signify a text adherence to the principles of textual cohesion. Over the course of Pearson's analysis, she identifies two distinct approaches to transmedia storytelling within these categories, being potentially quite useful for students' work and for the creative design of transmedia projects, and also for the expansion and development of character using transmedial approaches to story writing. The first category that Pearson identifies is time-place transmedia stories, which are essentially narratives that unfold across multiple platforms and formats, whereby the story's setting and timeline play a crucial role in shaping the narrative and audience experience, which ultimately leads to her hypothesis over the course of her analysis that cohesion, and I quote, cohesion in time-place transfictions arises primarily from points of contact between editions and the transfiction's previous events and settings. Similarly, with respect to the second category of Pearson's discussion, she equally leads to hypothesize that cohesion in character transfictions, as distinct from the previous category, character transfictions, arises primarily from points of contact between character and the edition, and the character's name, function, and template established by the transfiction itself as well. So character-based transmedia stories in this context for Pearson, those which are in many ways closely aligned with the creative approaches to transmedial character development described previously, where backstory and story strands and narrative fragmentation lead to the migration of characters across multiple media platforms as part of a process of character development and expansion. Pearson's ultimate conclusion is one which designates different requirements with regard to points of contact when comparing time-place transmedia stories with character-based transfictions, but one which can't help but allude to best practice in transmedia storytelling that essentially underscores the importance of points of contact and the primacy of narrative cohesion in transmedial approaches to storytelling. So in that sense, what Pearson is arguing for is essentially the importance of points of contact and narrative cohesion within transmedia storytelling. Okay, and that brings us to our next category of consideration in the analysis of transmedia storytelling, which is, of course, place. before considering time and setting and place within the context of transmedia storytelling practices, it might be useful initially to briefly explore the importance and significance of setting within classic narrative storytelling practices as well, in the same way that our analysis of character was essentially approached. While setting in a broad sense can be essentially defined as the place where actions and events of a story occur, it crucially represents more than just the spatial location of a plot. Narrative setting also encompasses the time, atmospheres, and the social, political, and cultural environment where action takes place, and can also encompass inner space. Narrative setting might also be used potentially as a narrative device to potentially mirror the images of a character's emotions or mental state as well. Setting can shape characters, influence the atmosphere of a story, and serve as the catalyst for plot. And as such, it can be the difference between an everyday story and an exciting journey into an unknown world. As a way in which to explore this notion of place, I thought I'd try something different. I actually found this online when I was doing some research for this lecture, and it's the prologue from a book called The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, who won the Hugo Award for the best novel in 2016. It potentially might help us engage on a slightly different level with the notion of place. Plants everywhere will die, and the animals that depend on them will starve, and the animals that eat those will starve. Winter will come early and hard, and it will last a long, long time. It will end, of course, like every winter does, and then the world will return to its old self eventually. The people of the stillness live in a perpetual state of disaster preparedness. They've built walls and dug wells and put away food, and they can easily last 5, 10, even 25 years in a world without sun, eventually meaning in this case in a few thousand years. Look, the ash clouds are spreading already. In this story world, the planet undergoes apocalyptic seasons every few centuries, and the sky is dotted with mysterious obelisks, massive crystalline shards that hover amid the clouds, rotating slowly and drifting along incomprehensible flight paths. Within this particular story, characters called Oragons are the people with the power to move Earth, but they're essentially persecuted in this world. And as an example of the significance of narrative setting, all the story elements are essentially constructed to a certain extent by the setting itself. So in this sense, the story world presents itself as an apocalyptic environment that faces constant earthquakes. The storyline is a society trying to survive environmental catastrophe, and the characters are people who face discrimination and social conditions directly shaped by the environment. And whilst I haven't read this book, I can imagine perhaps that the place and the setting for this story could almost be utilised as a device to reflect the inner space and emotional landscape of the story's main protagonist. Something to struggle with, something to push against, and something to hopefully transcend. To bring things back to a somewhat more mundane engagement with narrative setting, it might nonetheless be useful for our consideration of some of the elements which can contribute to setting spaces in narrative structures, where setting refers to time and place and overall environment in which a story unfolds, encompassing both physical, social, and potentially psychological contexts. So within the context of place and setting are these elements which firstly relate to time, historical period, seasons, time of the day, events that influence the story. It relates secondarily to place, geographical location, whether real or fictional, and it can range from a specific room to essentially an entire world. Environment, the physical surrounds, social customs, and the cultural atmosphere of the story setting, and purpose. Setting helps to immerse the reader, establish the mood, and even can reveal character traits and foreshadow events as well. So yes, to bring things back to a somewhat more mundane engagement, but nonetheless useful, time and place, environment and purpose, all informing, in a sense, a broader notion of setting and place. Okay, so to focus now on transmedia storytelling approaches. Within a transmedial story, the setting, the place, the time, the setting functions in a similar way to the way it does within classic narrative structures that we've just explored before, but with a few key differences, largely because settings can be constructed across multiple platforms or mediums. Some things to consider within the context of place and time and setting as it relates to transmedia storytelling. Firstly, world building and narrative depth. Place and setting can be fundamental to creating immersive story worlds and engaging with story contexts. Transmedia projects often feature distinct locations that serve as settings for characters and events, and because narrative settings traverse not just spatial locations but different mediums and platforms, there is some potential in this context to use features of transmediality to facilitate a more in-depth exploration of story, character and themes because of the additional layers and details essentially available. Transmedia stories often involve a complex of interconnected worlds that extend beyond a single medium. The setting can be used to explore larger themes and social environments, allowing for the examination of the past and the present and the future, as just one example of the creative potential of transmedial approaches to storytelling. Similarly also, transmedia storytelling often involves characters, setting and plot elements that appear across various media platforms, each contributing to the overall narrative in a unique way, creating, in a sense, a more detailed story world and potentially enhancing audience engagement. In terms of platform-specific exploration, each platform, say for example a film or a game or a website, can explore different facets of the setting, offering unique perspectives and experiences. This can potentially allow for a richer and more layered understanding of a story world in a sense. Of importance to note, though, is that some platforms are perhaps more conducive to certain narratives more than others. TikTok, for example, is commonly a very playful context and platform and conducive essentially to comedic content and not necessarily that conducive to overly dramatic or overly serious content. So in this sense, the platforms themselves can either be conducive or maybe not as supportive in a construction of kind of like setting and place for transmedial storytelling, which could inform certain creative choices made in transmedial narrative design. So a knowledge of platforms essentially as a place is actually really important in narrative design for transmedia storytelling as well. Narrative tone comes into play in this context also. The author or the narrator's attitudes or perspectives towards the subject matter or character or audience, which shape the overall mood and the atmosphere of the story. Matching the narrative tone of a story, its corresponding narrative context, and the platform is one of the considerations that could and should inform narrative design and creative approaches to transmedial storytelling. And lastly, consistency and cohesion. Maintaining a consistent and coherent internal logic, essentially correlating to the overarching story world, is an important consideration for narrative storytelling and central to creating and maintaining a unified transmedia experience. Story world continuity and preservation is an important consideration of narrative design and creative approaches to transmedia storytelling as well. All right. Next up, we're looking at plot with regard to transmedia storytelling. In terms of a broadly understood definition of plot, which within classic narrative storytelling, the plot essentially refers to the events of a story arranged into dramatically effective order, but one not necessarily corresponding to chronology. It is these sequences of events that drive the story and reveal cause and effect relationships between actions and incidents. It's essentially the what and the why of a story, showing what happens and why it happens. Many of the attributes of classic storytelling equally apply to the design of plot within transmedia storytelling contexts. These include elements both related to a focused definition of plot and extend to a broader aspect of story design as well, and narrative construction. These might include things such as plot points corresponding to narrative arcs, exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution, plot points relating to turning points, for example, and conflict and ultimate denouement as well as a 3-act or 5-act or 8-point arc. So, what is the difference about plots within the context of transmedia storytelling? Transmedia storytelling, arguably the plot isn't just a linear sequence of events, but in many cases a complex web of interconnected narratives and story elements that unfold across multiple platforms and media, essentially inviting audience participation and exploration of the story world. As distinct from traditional storytelling, transmedia plots aren't confined to single mediums or linear narrative threads, and essentially they transcend beyond single narratives in this sense. Key plot elements, characters, settings, and themes are often dispersed across various platforms like films and games and books and websites, streaming services and social media, and in this sense it involves interconnected story elements. Transmedia storytelling encourages active participation as a point of difference, also allowing audiences to explore different facets of a story. And in open system narratives, for example, they're able to contribute to plot design and to plot directionality as well. And lastly, as a point of difference also for transmedia storytelling, is the notion of plot and world building. Transmedia often focuses on creating rich, expansive worlds where multiple characters and storylines can coexist and evolve over time, and plot lines are a contributing element to this process in a broad sense as well. And finally, as a way in which to conclude our consideration of plot within the context of transmedia storytelling, I actually just wanted to bring our focus back one last time to one of the readings assigned for this week by media theorist Mary-Laura Ryan, as a way in which to essentially sort of engage with the idea of plots and how they can be constructed within the context of transmedia story structures. So media theorist Mary-Laura Ryan analyzes a number of transmedia texts that have kind of received both critical acclaim and a wide degree of popularity in this week's reading. In transmedia storytelling industry buzzword or new narrative experience, her critical appreciation for both plot and story design in many ways is kind of heard to echo that of Henry Jenkins for its regard for The Matrix, essentially as an exemplar of transmedia storytelling practice, and a hugely important example of a new narrative experience in contemporary storytelling. Her analysis of The Matrix is quite interesting, and I actually thought that this remark with regard to the Matrix and essentially the way it was constructed in consideration of plots was actually quite insightful. So she writes, the overall structure of the Matrix franchise can be compared to pieces of Swiss cheese. The film presents an image of the story world that's full of plot holes. The function of the other documents is to fill these holes so that the user can form a more complete, more coherent mental representation of the world. Conversely, the film provides information that completes the stories told by the other documents. Therefore, each element of the system depends on other documents for the plugging of its holes, essentially the plugging of its holes in the Swiss cheese. And I thought that was a nice metaphor to end on as a final consideration of a very clever design within the context of transmedia storytelling as it relates to plot. Okay, just as a way to conclude our consideration of transmedia storytelling, and just a way of wrapping up things in a sense, I thought it might be good to provide just a small degree of balance and conclude today's lecture by briefly considering the role and indeed the potential of transmedia storytelling for non-fiction modes of communication. Whilst there does tend to be a really strong focus on the relationship between fiction and transmedia storytelling in a lot of the literature and critical discourse surrounding it as essentially a new media phenomena. Marie Law Ryan actually makes a really good case in this week's reading for non-fiction transmedia storytelling and provides a nice overview, in a sense, of a number of fascinating approaches to non-fiction transmedia storytelling, which utilise multi-mode forms of delivery to convey a cohesive narrative, non-fiction narrative, essentially in alignment with a lot of the concepts and ideas that we've discussed in this lecture as well. In terms of non-fiction approaches to transmedia storytelling, one particular project's actually popped up on my radar over the past month or two, and that's actually the Northern Irish cultural project. I think is probably a good way to describe it. Cultural project called Kneecap. These guys actually played here in Melbourne at the beginning of March on Labor Day holiday. I wonder if anyone in the lecture actually managed to get along. They played there for free and managed to draw a crowd of around about 10,000 people. In terms of my awareness of the group, they popped up on my radar last year, not because of their music per se, but because they were involved in the release of a film called Kneecap, essentially a biopic film. It was screened at a number of film festivals last year, and it went on to be shortlisted for 2 Academy Awards. The film stars members of the group as well as a very famous Irish actor called Michael Fassbender. And it's actually recently been picked up by Madman Entertainment for release and distribution here in Australia. And it was actually Madman that flew them out to essentially play this free show at Federation Square, but also to do a bunch of media slots talking about the film, talking about their kind of cultural project, political project, as well as their music as well. And they did manage to gain quite a lot of attention as a result of their visit out here. As a non-fiction transmedia storytelling project, it's one that spans film and social media, I suppose traditional broadcast media, and of course music, with the release of their album last year, which was receiving some acclaim at the same time as their film was kind of gaining some traction and popularity as well. The project's utilization of transmedia storytelling to engage and expand audiences is a significant aspect of transmedia storytelling that we've chatted about throughout this lecture. What's actually really interesting in the context of Kneecap is the way that it's used essentially as a form of cross-promotion and marketing too, and it's really quite apparent that there's a really strong relationship between marketing and transmedia storytelling, which is of course something that's important to consider in a broader context of media systems analysis, and it was something that was brought up in last week's lecture by Dan as well. In many ways, it's an important aspect of transmedia storytelling to consider that might be a topic for further discussion in this week's tutorials potentially. I suppose the only other thing of note to kind of like talk about is, in addition to music and and film as two components of a transmedia storytelling project. The other one that is kind of gaining some attention is essentially their advocacy for Irish native language as well, and this seems to be sort of like tapping into a number of different kind of like political issues that relates to Indigenous sovereignty and decolonization projects as well. And so in this sense, it almost seems as if this political discourse is now wrapping itself up as an additional kind of like layer within a multi-layered sort of transmedia storytelling project, which is actually really quite fascinating to consider. If you get a chance, jump onto YouTube. There's a bunch of footage actually from their performance at Federation Square, massive numbers, and I suppose as a closing remark, I would just put it out to you to essentially engage with the idea of transmedia storytelling in the media that you consume. Potentially it's embedded within the social media platforms and a lot of the content that is actually kind of like within your feeds. And potentially, like me, you may well be sort of like noticing it a little bit more because of the centrality of transmedia storytelling in this unit. In terms of a little bit of homework, if you can essentially just jot down some notes or take down a few details with regard to the media that you consume and potentially the place of transmedia storytelling within the media you consume, and bring that to workshops this week as something that we can potentially have a chat about. So I hope all's well with you, and I look forward to seeing you in the workshops. All the best. See ya.